Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started and kind of let people trickle in. Before we get started, again, welcome to this webinar. Thank you for being here for today's session. Hopefully you will get a lot out of this. I have a good number of participants, so that's awesome. Just want to mention a few things. For one, the slide deck, if you can see the webinar slide, that's great. If it looks off or it looks kind of large, just want to point out something you can do in the upper left-hand corner. There's like a magnifying glass over a paper. If you extend that, you should see some view controls to control how you want to view the slide deck. It has like a plus minus. And then the one I would recommend is the third one, which is entitled, I believe, Best Fit, just so everybody can see the slide deck very well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar, which the topic will be managing the online classroom. So we're going to look at, just like any classroom, it has to be managed properly, but we're going to look at it from the perspective of the online environment, because just like a face-to-face classroom, when it comes to managing the class, the goal is essentially to establish, maintain some type of environment that promotes the goals and the objectives of the course. But in the online learning environment, there's some unique challenges that we should be aware of as online instructors, facilitators, that requires specific skills and approaches in how we facilitate online learning. So that's kind of going to be the focus of today's webinar. But before we get started, I would like to introduce myself and my team members. I'm Mr. Frank Rosenkrantz. As far as my background, when I was in the military, I spent 23 years in active duty Air Force, and during that time, about half of that time I spent in AETC as either a tech school instructor. Yes, I was a life support, absolutely, Tandra. I kind of started out in life support, but even in life support, I was in what was called ATC back then. We did a lot of instruction. And I also taught in the tech school environment for AWACS and Joint Stars, and then finished out my career in the Air Force teaching at the NCOA, the Non-Commissioned Officers Academy. As a civilian, I worked for FEMA for about a year as a training specialist before coming over back to Keesler, working at the 336 for a couple of years, and then moving over into FACD, teaching BIC for a few years, and now teaching the IDLE course. Joining me are Ms. Brittany Hall and Mrs. Monica Garcia. Both are very well versed in the subject matter we're covering today, and they're going to be kind of monitoring the chat window. So you all, if you have any questions, if you need anything clarified, we really encourage you to just type something in the chat window, and they will be monitoring to answer those types of questions. So we want to make this interactive. Don't feel like you just have to sit and listen to me. By all means, feel free to pop in a question, or maybe even, this is all about sharing knowledge. If you have your own, gems you want to share with us, by all means, please share those, and we will have them kind of monitor and help us along the way. So our agenda today, we're going to cover a couple areas. First, we're going to look at the roles of the instructor. And very similar to a face-to-face classroom, there's certain roles that you play in the classroom. And we'll look at those from the online perspective and what the responsibilities are in those roles and how we approach those roles and execute those roles in an online environment. So once we have an understanding of those four roles, we'll move into the mitigating unwanted behavior. Again, just like a face-to-face, there are some behaviors that are desired versus undesired, but we want to look at how do they manifest themselves in an online environment, and then not only that, but how do we address them effectively in that same environment. And in the same vein, kind of associated with that, is something called test integrity, which definitely brings some unique challenges that are inherent to the online environment when it comes to testing. So we'll look at what type of strategies, practices, what we can do to help ensure that we maintain as best we can the testing integrity in an online environment. And that leads right into the netiquette situation. We'll talk about first, we hear this word netiquette, which is basically nothing more than online etiquette, but we'll kind of look at what it is and how in an online environment, we as instructors, facilitators, designers, combine together to help encourage that proper netiquette takes place in the classroom, some certain practices and approaches we can take for that. And lastly, we want to bring it all together. We're going to look at some specific efficiencies, best practices that support the classroom management. And we'll divide those in three specific areas: the preparation, the delivery, and the closeout, and kind of look at how those roles that we talked about earlier can directly be applied in those efficiencies. So let's go ahead and begin with looking at those roles. Four different roles specifically we will look at: the instructor, pedagogical, the managerial, the counselor, social, and technical. And like I mentioned, they're very similar to those face-to-face classroom roles. For anybody that's taken the big class, for instance, these roles probably look very familiar, but they're just performed a little differently. The methods are a little different in the long online environment. And one important thing to remember is these roles aren't necessarily performed independently from one another. So it's not like, okay, from 10 to 11, I'm going to be in the instructor role, and from 2 to 4, I'm going to be the counselor. They kind of overlap. It's a very fluid situation. They intertwine, they overlap according to what's going on in the classroom. So it's very situational, essentially. For example, if I'm an instructor, I can simultaneously be performing in the social role. It kind of all blend together in that aspect. So you can kind of call it, it's like multitasking almost, or I guess you can call it multi-rolling. I don't think that's a word. I just coined one. Multi-rolling, let's call it that. So now let's break it down. Let's look at each and kind of look at specific responsibilities that they have. First, the instructor, pedagogical. The primary responsibility here is building knowledge, no different than a face-to-face. The focus should be on the critical concepts, principles, what skills are required, and the difference is just how we do it. This is, you'll commonly refer to the instructor in an online environment as a what we call the virtual instructor, because they're there but they're not physically there. So that term virtual instructor kind of came from that. But at the end of the day, it's still about building knowledge, just like in a face-to-face classroom. The approaches you can take in doing that and some of the challenges involved are, for instance, gauging understanding. How do you gauge understanding in an online environment when you can't see the student, when you can't see them nod their head or read their body language or things of that nature? So I'll put that out to you all. If you're in an online environment, you're trying to get your students' understanding, what could you do you think you could do to help you identify that? Emojis, okay, yes. Ask questions. That's probably the best way, honestly. You literally ask them. If you've just covered something, just ask them. That will gauge your understanding. I like the polls, the quizzes. Absolutely. That's a good way to do that. In some cases, yes, cameras. Some institutions do use those, but absolutely. But the bottom line is, we want to ask them questions, through assessments, even through participation. Just gauging how involved and engaged they are in the course itself can act as an indicator to us as far as their level of understanding of the material. So in that instance, we really want to encourage that knowledge sharing. We want to allow our students to share knowledge, just like I'm doing here. I'm asking you, what do you think you can do? So I'm allowing you to be involved in the curriculum, in this session itself, and discuss and think about things critically versus me as the instructor just having that one-way conversation of this is how you do it and there's no other way. You want to encourage that sharing of knowledge because our students, they know a lot and they have a lot to offer and bring into the online environment, and we should be flexible enough to allow that. And again, speaking of flexibility, following the flow of the conversation while still guiding the outcome towards whatever the subject matter is. Sometimes we might have to vary our approaches. We adapt to how the class is going. I might see something a student says in the chat, and maybe I'll go off course slightly because whatever was shared might be relevant, might be interesting, and might provide some understanding of the material from a different perspective. So, be flexible in as you conduct your sessions, and try to stay away from that authoritarian type instructor-centered method and be more active learning student-centered. You don't want to just lecture 3-4 hours straight. That tends to be very unmotivating. So design, educational experiences that make the material itself relevant. That tends to motivate students because that's part of it. That feedback we give to our students as well tends to motivate them. Even consider referencing to other sources outside of your own, or asking the students to look for references. Again, the key is as the instructor, you want to be engaging, and you want to, more than anything else, facilitate the building of knowledge. So the next role we'll look at is the managerial. Here we are looking more at organizational, procedural, administrative tasks, kind of keeping everything on course, making sure everything is where it needs to be, that's associated with the learning environment. And in that endeavor, some of the things we can do are the syllabus. Syllabus is big, making sure it's available and making sure it includes everything required to help us manage the class, like the course schedule, different policies, expectations. Contact information is really big, so the students have a way to reach out and talk to you if they need to. Setting up adaptive releases, which basically means coordinating different assignments, making sure they're available when they're supposed to be available, and making sure that they're not available when they're not supposed to be available. That's part of the management aspect. And one of the biggest ones probably is time management. As a facilitator, as an online instructor, we really have to be cognizant of how we manage our time. That might include grading. How do we grade, or when do we grade our students' papers or essays or whatever assignments they may have, making sure it's done in a timely manner. We all can relate to that coming from a student perspective. For all those online learners who have experience in it, where we turn something in and you generally want to see a quick turnaround. You don't want to wait 3-4 days or weeks before you get your grade back. And what that does is it hinders progress, because as a student, you really don't know how well you're doing in the course. So part of that time management, managing the LMS itself, the learning management system, whether it's Blackboard, Canvas, whatever the case may be, making sure the students are enrolled, you have accountability for those students, managing the course content itself, monitoring your students, responding to messages in a timely manner, opening and closing things, whether it's a course or assignments. So all that are part of the management concept. And your daily announcements is another one, making sure you have daily announcements, putting announcements out there as needed, managing those discussion forums, looking at the participation, monitoring the interactions between students. So all that kind of encompasses some of those management skills within an online environment. So hopefully you're starting to see something here. And that is that sometimes there's a myth or a thinking that online instruction is easy. You just throw PowerPoints online, you throw the course material online, you sit back and let the students teach themselves. Hopefully you're starting getting the idea that it's a lot more involved than that, especially as we get into these different roles than just dumping what they call a course dump, which generally does not work very well in the online environment. Our next area we will look at is the counselor social role. And just like in a face-to-face, this is one of those roles we have to fulfill. The point of it really in a online environment, one of the major things you want to do in the online environment is promote a sense of community, a friendly environment, so the students feel like they belong. Because for an online environment, it's a little difficult because generally everybody's geographically separated. It's hard to build continuity and community due to that separation, especially if there's no synchronous interaction. Because there's a lot of courses, probably most courses, are totally asynchronous. They don't have that synchronous aspect. I recommend, if you can, and I understand every course is different, but I would strongly recommend try to at least have one or two synchronous sessions to kind of help build that sense of community. But it is difficult and it's planned. As an instructor, you cannot sit back and just hope it happens. As a facilitator, you have to be proactive in making it happen. And in doing so, one of the biggest things, and I saw a few of you mentioned it already, is that social presence. We talked about the virtual instructor earlier. So now you have to make your presence known in that online environment. This ties directly to motivation. You have to be there, but in a genuine way. Students quickly figure out if you're there but not there. Have any of you ever experienced an online classroom and the instructor just didn't seem like they were really there? They weren't approachable, they weren't around. And with that, I'd also like you to ask this. When that happens, what's the effect? What type of consequences happen due to that lack of involvement by the instructor? Less effort. That's a very good point, Rebecca, because if the instructor is only putting minimum effort, a lot of times students say, well, why should I put 110% if the instructor does not seem to care? Anthony, very good. Bad communication, lack of motivation, less interest. Great answers. That's what I'm talking about. That's why we have to put ourselves out there socially and be involved, be there genuinely. I recommend use an image of yourself, something that the students can look at and kind of put a face to the instructor. Include a bio so the instructors know a little bit about your background, and include personal information. Don't keep it strictly, I got a degree in this and I went to this school and I'm qualified in this. Create something interesting, some hobbies, some interests, just to kind of personalize yourself, and that tends to help build that sense of community in a classroom. We want that collective identity, that cohesion, and it's up to us. Icebreakers are great, but even with icebreakers, try to be a little more creative, other than the standard, okay, for the icebreaker, what's your name, where are you from, and just introduce yourself. Because a lot of times the bio or the introductions, we require interaction. I know one stands out to me particularly that one of my students actually brought up in an idle class. He was in an entomology class. It was basically studying insects. And they had a really, really creative and cool icebreaker. They asked the students to answer the question, if they were an insect, which insect would they be and why would they be that insect. And that's interesting. That you can have fun with that. You can respond to that. It's something to kind of make you think. So think in those terms. How can I make it interesting? How can I create icebreakers that will help build that collective identity and cohesion? I know in IDLE, we use infographics instead of writing just who are you. We require you to put some type of visual representation of yourself in as the icebreaker, as the introduction. So just something different, to help motivate, because that's the big part of that social presence. Motivate, encourage the participation, be accepting. Don't judge too harshly those who don't participate. Some people are just very shy. Some people, believe it or not, are technophobic. They just have an aversion to technology in general, but we have to be accepting of them. We have to be kind of objectively judge them and not be too harsh, like, well, they're not participating, something's wrong with them. And we'll kind of look at that further when we get into some of those unwanted behaviors. But we also at the same time want to reinforce those desired behaviors. So if they're doing things right, we want to reinforce that. And we want to respond to our students in a timely manner, and we also want to address their issues objectively, whether it's through email, whether it's through a telephone call, however we deal with them. But again, I can't stress enough, be there. The students should feel like they have an instructor available, and they have an instructor that is genuinely concerned with their progress in the course. The next area is the technical. And believe it or not, when it comes to the technical, according to a lot of studies, this is one of the most significant causes of student dissatisfaction with online courses, is dealing with technical issues. Granted, there's only so much we can control. If a student in California's headset doesn't work, I can't really control that. However, we have to do as much as we can. Our responsibility is really to help the learners feel comfortable within the system and the software they're using. So being able to address technical concerns or diagnose and clarify some specific issues. So now we'll look at some of those. Ops check. That can be very preventative. I like to call it preventative maintenance. Check the system yourself. Make sure everything works. Are there any broken links? Have you as the facilitator or instructor should have a general knowledge about the LMS and its functions, so you can check for these things and fix like the little things. No one's expecting you to be a computer expert, but you should at a minimum just be able to fix the little things in that manner. What I tend to do, this is kind of my thing, I tend to go a day ahead. If, for instance, I know what students are going to be looking at on Tuesday, on Monday, I'll check all the links and everything that's required for Tuesday, just to kind of give myself a warm fuzzy that, okay, everything should work fine. Review feedback. Sometimes the students will let you know, hey, this isn't working. And be mindful of that, and maybe take some notes or document the things you get from your students, so at the end of the course you can go back and fix them, especially it's a prevalent thing that kind of happens over and over. Computer support. Since you may not be a computer expert, at a minimum, try to reach out to someone that is the expert. A lot of times the work center itself might have a local guru in there that kind of knows everything about computers. Know who that person is and kind of get in touch with them. There might be some instructional guidance out there, some web links. I saw Brittany mentioned about the Italian. That was a very unique situation. A student actually said, hey, my Blackboard is in Italian. And I was literally like, I've never encountered that before. But what's my job? I have to help this person out. And believe it or not, it was an easy fix. All I did, because again, I didn't know on the spot, well, what to do if your Blackboard's in a foreign language. I Googled it. I literally Googled it. I literally Googled Blackboard in foreign language. And in 3 steps, fixed the problem. So now I look like a hero, but I really didn't know. I just Googled it. I guess they could have did the same thing. But knowing where to go, what type of guidance is out there, web links that can help you with that, and being able to refer those learners to those resources helps as well. And then backup plan, contingencies. Have a contingency. I like to call it the what if list. Kind of create what if. What if this happens? What if that happens? What will happen if we do this? And a lot of times you don't know you need something, a backup, until it actually happens. We might be sitting in a synchronous session and all of a sudden there's an active shooter exercise. Okay, now what? How do we stop class? What are the policies? What are procedures? So be thinking about those things. Alternate ways of communication. I know when we teach the EIDL course, we have something called a meet me line. So if all fails, if the students can't hear, if the phone option doesn't work, they can still use the meet me line, call in and hear everything they're saying, and then follow along on their own computer. So those are definitely have those backup plans. Using different browsers is another one. I mean, I can't access this. Try a different browser. We record the synchronous sessions, offering those recordings up in case students do have serious technical issues, like my hard drive just died. We can record the session and then still have access to those things. So at the end of the day, just kind of really think about what if. What if this happens? What would we do about it in this online classroom? So there you have it. Those are the 4 roles and kind of the responsibilities in those roles and the approaches and methods we take in executing those roles. And they will become apparent as we get into in our next area, which is mitigating unwanted behavior. So my question to you is, in an online environment, what would you consider unwanted behavior? How do you think that would manifest itself, or what constitutes unwanted behavior in your opinion online? Yes, bullying, language, yes. Arguing. Arguing is an interesting one because there's a fine line between constructive debate and unconstructive arguing. So that's actually a really good. Not capitalizing all caps is generally understood as yelling, sending too many emojis. Ah, yes, that's a good one. Emojis are great, but with anything else, balance, balance, balance. You don't want to literally talk in emoji only. I actually had one student that refused to use emojis. That was kind of funny. He believed it was, I guess, not very professional. And that's not unusual either. A lot of institutions will specifically talk about emojis. But yes, there's a lot of good examples, and the list is very long. Ignores advice, doesn't keep in contact regularly, or just the offensive remarks, or plagiarism. We've had issues with plagiarism that sometimes rears its ugly head, or not very active in the class, or doesn't want to be active. The problem with unwanted behaviors and mitigating it is that it's sometimes hard to decipher, especially in a text-based environment. Text-based communication kind of lends itself sometimes to misinterpretation because we can't see or hear the person. So tone can be very difficult to distinguish, whether it's sarcasm or humor. So you have to be really careful with that so that the message is not misinterpreted. So in that same vein, when you're addressing an issue, you kind of have to make sure that it wasn't taken out of context, or that maybe the interpretation or the meaning was based on some type of assumptions. But absolutely something we have to be aware of. And in my opinion, this is more difficult than in a face-to-face, because in a face-to-face, a lot of times it's very apparent. Hey, the student's over there sleeping, or there's 2 students doing something they're not supposed to be doing. Where online, it's sometimes harder to uncover. But one thing we can do is, first and foremost, set the example. We have to be the ones that set the tone. lead by example. We have to follow established norms and, as far as language and distractions, and we have to build that rapport. So here's my question to you, since we just covered it. When it comes to mitigating unwanted behavior, from those roles we talked about, which role do you think would be the dominant one, or the one that we would use most in mitigating unwanted behaviors? Counseling, yes, the counselor role, that social presence, absolutely. Everything we talked about at counseling really starts to come through in mitigating these unwanted behaviors. So we have to set the example, build that rapport with our students, that social presence, and we also have to sometimes be able to anticipate anything before it happens. Anticipate some of those controversies that might happen, especially, like, for instance, if there's discussion forums and just through past experience that certain questions might create some debate. And again, there's nothing wrong with constructive debate, which is very common in discussion forums. Not everybody thinks the same way, but as facilitators and online instructors, our job is to keep everything constructive. So there might be some questions we already know ahead of time that might spark some debate or something unwanted down the line. So, making the students aware of that and kind of maybe reinforcing the idea of, like, look, let's keep it professional, and things of that matter. So, and then once it does happen, if it does happen, the big thing is deal with it. We have to act on it immediately. We cannot let it fester. We cannot let it kind of linger and just hope it magically goes away, because usually what tends to happen, it just goes. So deal with, especially discipline issues, deal with it immediately. Try to defuse those conflicts as soon as you see any inkling of it. But the question then is, well, how do we do this? Remember, we're online. Different ways. Privately is one way, or publicly. And there's no perfect answer. It's all situational, depending on what's going on. But with that, when it comes to public reminders, be aware that you don't want to call anybody out by name. I would never say, on a public announcement, as we saw yesterday, Sergeant such and such was a real jerk, so let's try not to be like him. That probably would be very counterproductive for that person. Now they would totally shut down and would not want to be involved in the class at all. So therefore, kind of be aware of that. Emails, phone calls, even a phone call would work great, especially for issues that are more complicated, that might involve some personal problems or some issues that are going on with the students. Sometimes a phone call is the best way, because you create that two-way conversation. That way you eliminate or mitigate the issue of trying to interpret tone of voice and things of that nature. So that's a good way. And above all, a lot of you have probably heard of the progressive discipline process, using the least amount of force necessary to change the behavior. That's really what we're looking for. And then be supportive as that in that counselor role when you're mitigating those behaviors. Kind of react objectively and supportively, because you want to kind of get at the bottom of what the issue is, so as the mitigator, you don't misinterpret or misunderstand issues themselves. Now, similar to an unwanted behavior, we have to consider test integrity. In an online environment, this can be tough to do, because, again, in a classroom, as an instructor, I can see my students, I can walk around. It's relatively easy to spot any type of testing as compared to the online environment. So with that, we really have to take a different mindset when it comes to test integrity. And first and foremost, kind of have that mindset as if every test is open book. So in that instance, we have to use questions that kind of challenge the students in forming their answers. via either threaded discussions or blogs or things of that nature. So more application versus knowledge. Not so much the yes or no questions, the close-ended questions, the simple questions on a test, because that really makes the integrity issue a little easier to overcome as a student if they're dead set on cheating. And I also like to put this out there. There's really no evidence that cheating is more prevalent online than in a classroom. It's just an issue that we still have to consider designing online courses. So before you even develop the course, in the design phase, especially when we're talking ADDIE, for those of you familiar with the model, in the design phase, you really want to kind of flesh out this stuff when it comes to the testing. Use a variation, different types of question, essay type, case studies, more complex questions. Now, I also need to put this out there. A lot of this is driven by the proficiency levels. So kind of keep that in mind too. I mean, if you have an A-level proficiency, understand that it is a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to create essays and case studies and more complex type questions for your assessments, because a lot of times your proficiency levels will dictate the extent to which you can do that. But even if not, using those memory type questions is not bad for just to kind of facilitate student progress. Maybe review questions, end of unit questions, things of that nature. Alternate the testing, create question pools, randomizing your questions. All those help in mitigating those test integrity issues. And don't forget software. There is software that can help us. The Respondus is a popular one. SafeAssign, which Blackboard uses. They're all ways that you can help in that situation. And what I always recommend is a combination. Use a combination of the software combined with different specific strategies together, and that can help. Again, we're talking about mitigating, minimizing. Can you 100% stop cheating? Probably not. But at the very least, we want to make it as hard as possible. We want to try to mitigate it as much as possible. Some courses even have cameras where the student is required a camera so the instructor can observe them, and kind of like a proctoring, and observe them taking the test. We actually do that in our big class, which is kind of temporary online right now, and that is a method that we have instituted using video cameras. So just things to think about. Just realize this is something you have to consider when you're managing your classrooms, the whole test integrity issue. A lot of the answers to this can be solved by having some type of netiquette. Strongly recommend netiquette. And kind of in the same vein, speaking of still back on the test integrity, it's not a bad idea to have some type of academic integrity policy in your course, whether it's in the syllabus or on the actual website or the LMS, that the students have to acknowledge. Because netiquette is nothing more than a code of behavior. Polite behavior according to the ethics of your course. It's the word netiquette that is used. But I suggest every course have some type of netiquette guide in their course. And when it comes, the reason you really want that is it provides some standards. It allows all the students to know exactly what the expectations of the course are. So that's big. What it does also is create accountability, making the students accountable so they can't say, well, I didn't know, because what you should do is have them acknowledge that they have read it, they understand it, and not only understand it, that they agree with it. That's important. A lot of courses I'm in right now do that. They say, I read the standards, understand them, and acknowledge them, and agree with them. That way, if something does happen, you can say, well, according to this Netiquette guide, which is it's really a metric for facilitators to help us evaluate and respond to that inappropriate behavior, because we have a guide that can help do that. So it kind of presents the rules to the students. And as far as some general guidelines, I'm going to really quickly provide you a link. This is a pretty decent link that provides you with some general guidelines that you can add to your Netiquette guide. And of course, each class, every course is different, but this is a good starting point to kind of help you put together some type of Netiquette. And even when you're putting it together, present the rules in a positive way. Instead of saying don't interrupt your classmates, you can say please use the signal icon when you want to participate in a discussion. Just kind of puts more positive spin on it. I guess it's a psychological thing. But definitely include that Netiquette. That can help alleviate a lot of the issues, because the students clearly understand what's expected and they clearly have an understanding of what the standards are. So now we will look at some efficiencies. And here we're specifically looking at some best practices that can help us with managing our online classroom. And this is really a big management piece in as far as what we should be doing throughout the course. And I just broke it down in sections: the preparation, the delivery, and the closeout, and things that should be happening within each one of those areas. In the preparation, you generally I'll just relate it to the course I teach, which is the EIDL course. Generally, we prepare our course a week ahead of time. So here's a big managerial piece: the sending out welcome letters in the student email. Make sure it contains our contact information, course description and title, how to access the course, posting some type of welcoming announcement to the student, and guiding them to a start here, because a lot of times students will get to a LMS and, okay, now what do I click? Where should I go? Hopefully they see start here, and that's a general indicator. If you're new to this LMS, if you don't know where to go, start here. And that might include some of that contact information, bios I talked about earlier, and then course information also should be provided, just to give the students a sense of the course itself. And every course isn't like that, I wish they were. In our course, we tend to open up the course content 1 week ahead of time. So before the class even starts, the students have access to the information. We give them access to the assessments or the tests. However, as far as the content, the reading, we give them access ahead of time. And also it allows them to get comfortable with the LMS by providing access to the course content and those course tools. Because I know most courses I've taken, like the course I'm taking now, we don't have access to the course literally until it starts. So you have to already ahead of time be somewhat familiar with how the course operates and is delivered. The next area, the delivery, this is more managing those threaded discussions, making sure here you're really executing that social role again, making sure you respond to students effectively, even in those thread discussions. And in, I think, 2 weeks, I'll be doing another one of these specifically talking about threaded discussions, how to create them, how to construct them, and engage with those. But during the delivery, this is a big piece, is the threaded discussions, especially for those courses that don't have synchronous sessions built into their course. Responding and facilitating those discussions, making sure that they kind of come off the way they need to. That student engagement through daily announcements, monitoring their behavior, that's happening in the delivery portion, and managing your classroom, making sure the content available. Basically all that stuff we talked about earlier in those roles, that instructor role, the social role, the man, is still played out during delivery. And then the last area is the closeout, because when it's over, it's not really over. We still have to do some things when it comes to managing our courses, managing our classes when everything's over. And a closing announcement is always nice because I know for those who have taken EIDL, you can attest to this. It's a pretty intensive course. There's not a lot of downtime. So we appreciate that as instructors. So we tend to close out with some type of announcement thanking our students. We appreciate the hard work, the effort you put into this course because we understand that it takes effort and hard work and dedication in order to be successful in the EIDL course. So we want to give our students that sense of appreciation that they were able to get through the course and do well in the course. Making sure the grades are finalized and all posted. The course availability for the EIDL course, we keep the course open generally about 2 weeks. That allows the students to kind of go back and maybe review some information. They might want to download some PDFs that we put on in our course or some websites and create some type of digital library. So we keep our course open 2 weeks after the students actually finish or complete the course. And then feedback is big. It's kind of a hot wash. Kind of look back over the duration of the class and analyze, suggestions maybe the students bring up, recommendations, if there's things that need to be corrected, kind of refining the course. Are there any areas where the students didn't quite understand and anything we can improve on? Because courses, whether it's online or face-to-face, are very dynamic. It's not, well, this is the way it is, we teach it the same way every time, there's nothing to improve upon. Again, looking at the EIDL model, that evaluation piece where you're always evaluating, it's constant, you're around and around, it's never really over. So something else to think about when you're closing out. So hopefully you can really see that there's a lot involved in managing an online course. And if I were to take a poll, how many of you prefer, what do you prefer, face-to-face or online? Okay, good, good. And our preferences, whatever your preference is, a lot of times is determined by your experiences. If you had bad experiences in online courses, generally you prefer face-to-face. That's why, this is such an important piece. Understanding how to manage our courses and understanding all the different parts and what our role is, what skills we should possess as instructors, facilitators, can help change those minds. Because if we make the experience a positive experience, if we can make it relevant to our students, then generally, if we have a good experience, we tend to lean towards that as far as that preference. So again, we looked at the management of the classroom, so hopefully this information kind of helped you, especially those who are involved in online learning. It should become very apparent that it involves a lot more than just putting a PowerPoint up there and talking about it, and then letting the students essentially teach themselves. That's a misnomer. So hopefully this information kind of proved that point. And I thank you all for participating. We had some really great participation. But before I close out, I do want to kind of give you a point of contact. If you want some further assistance or instruction on online, we offer the EIDL course, which essentially is a course for developers, prepares kind of developers for analyzing and converting your traditional training programs into an online or blended environment. So kind of prep for those online course facilitators, where we discuss a lot of the strategies for facilitating online courses and kind of introducing you to different principles and theories and teaching strategies. We also have the analysis of learning, the AOL course, which guides students through some more key elements in the decision-making process. So this is more for those decision makers as they analyze the different components involved in determining which modality or instructional strategy is best to serve their needs. And then we also have the application of ISD, which explores the ISD process in course design. So for those that need some knowledge about course objectives, learning theories, instructional planning, the phases of the ISD and evaluation, this course should be great for you. And we have a contact, Mr. Craig Edwards, who can assist you scheduling if you are interested in any of these courses. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for a wonderful webinar experience. I really hope this was beneficial to you. We will be sending out or giving you access to recording of this session, and we will also send out some checklists. I talked about the delivery, the preparation, delivery, and closeout. We have some checklists for you that we will also send out along with the slide deck. So with that, I would again thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you again. Have a wonderful day.